Berlin, 1945. Smoke rises from shattered buildings. Women dig through rubble with bare hands. The smell of death hangs in the air. This is not a city anymore. It's a graveyard where the living still walk. For thousands of young German women, survival has become the only law. The war is over. Germany has lost. But the real battle is just beginning. The battle to eat, to find shelter, to live one more day. When American soldiers arrive in their clean uniforms with cigarettes and chocolate, some women see more than occupiers. They see a way out. Not love, not romance, but a ticket to survival. A passport stamped with desperation. Between 1945 and 1950, approximately 15,000 German women married American soldiers and left for the United States. They were called war brides. But for many, the choice had nothing to do with affection. It was cold calculation. Marry the enemy or starve with the defeated. This is the story of women who chose survival over everything else. Women who traded their language, their identity, and their homeland for a plate of food and an uncertain future. Women who discovered that escaping war was only the beginning, because in America, they would face a different kind of battle. One fought in silence, in isolation, and in the shadow of a marriage built on necessity, not love. The ruins stretched as far as the eye could see. Dresden, Hamburg, Berlin, Cologne. Cities that once stood proud now lay in pieces. 50 to 80% destroyed by Allied bombing raids. Buildings collapsed into themselves. Streets buried under mountains of brick and stone. Glass crunched underfoot everywhere you walked. The German economy had collapsed completely. The Reichsmark was worthless. Paper money meant nothing. People traded wedding rings for potatoes. Family heirlooms for a loaf of bread. The black market ruled everything. If you had cigarettes, you had power. If you had coffee, you were rich. If you had meat, you were a king. But most people had nothing. Food rations dropped to 800 to 1,200 calories per day. That's below the minimum needed for survival. Hunger carved faces into masks. Cheekbones jutted sharp. Eyes sank deep. Children cried at night, their stomachs empty and aching. The demographic catastrophe made everything worse. 5.3 million German men were dead. Millions more sat in Soviet prisoner of war camps, their fates unknown. For every 10 women of marriageable age, there were only 3 men. The traditional path to security, marriage to a German man, had vanished. Women became the backbone of Reconstruction. They were called Trümmerfrauen, women of the rubble. They formed human chains, passing bricks hand to hand. They cleared streets. They rebuilt walls. Their hands bled. Their backs bent. But they kept working because there was no choice. Winter made survival even harder. Cold bit through thin coats. Homes had no glass in the windows. Families huddled together under whatever blankets they could find. Frostbite claimed fingers and toes. Pneumonia killed the weak. Every day was a test of endurance. In this landscape of despair, the arrival of American troops changed everything. At first, the policy was clear. Non-fraternization. American soldiers were forbidden from interacting with German civilians. The order came down in May 1945. No talking, no trading, no relationships. The Germans were the enemy. Defeated, yes, but still the enemy. But by October 1945, the rules began to relax. Soldiers could speak to Germans, they could trade, and eventually, they could marry. The shift was gradual, but undeniable. Human nature pushed against military orders. Loneliness, curiosity, and opportunity found ways to break through. For German women, the Americans represented something almost unimaginable: abundance. Soldiers had access to cigarettes, chocolate, coffee, and nylon stockings, items that had become currency in the ruins. A single chocolate bar could buy a week's worth of bread on the black market. A pair of stockings could mean the difference between freezing and warmth. The women who associated with American soldiers were given a name: Amagirls. The term carried weight. Some used it neutrally, others spat it like a curse. These women were seen as traitors by many Germans, sleeping with the enemy, betraying their nation for comfort. The judgment was harsh and public, but for the women themselves, the calculation was simple: stay in Germany and face starvation, cold, and a future with no prospects, or take a chance with an American soldier, a man who could offer food, safety, and escape. The first encounters were awkward. Language barriers made communication difficult. German women spoke little to no English. American soldiers knew even less German. Gestures, smiles, and shared cigarettes became the language of connection. Some relationships began at dances organized by the occupation forces. Others started in the streets where soldiers handed out rations to hungry civilians. Not all of these relationships were romantic. Many were transactional. A woman might accept a soldier's attention because he brought food to her family. She might smile at him because his presence meant protection. She might agree to see him again because he represented the only path forward. One woman later recalled in an interview, "I did not love him. I loved the bread he brought." That honesty cuts through decades of romanticized narratives. For many war brides, love was a luxury they could not afford. Survival was the priority. Families played a role, too. Mothers encouraged daughters to pursue American soldiers, not out of cruelty, but out of desperation. If a daughter married an American, she could send packages home, food, clothing, medicine. The entire family could benefit. The pressure was subtle but real. Fear also drove decisions. Women in the western zones of occupation, controlled by America, Britain, and France, lived in terror of Soviet expansion. Stories of what happened in the Soviet zone spread quickly. Rape, forced labor, disappearances. Marrying an American meant escaping not just poverty but potential violence. The decision to marry was rarely made lightly. Women weighed their options in the cold calculus of survival. Stay and face an uncertain future in a destroyed nation, or leave with a man they barely knew, heading to a country they had only heard about in propaganda. For thousands of women, the answer became clear. They would choose survival, even if it meant leaving everything behind. On December 28, 1945, the United States Congress passed the War Brides Act. The law allowed foreign spouses of American military personnel to enter the United States, bypassing the strict immigration quotas that had been in place for decades. It was designed primarily for British, French, and Italian war brides, but it also applied to German women. The process was rigorous. Every woman who wanted to marry an American soldier and emigrate had to pass through layers of bureaucracy. First came the background investigation. American military officials checked the woman's history. Had she been a member of the Nazi Party? Had she participated in war crimes? Any affiliation with the regime could disqualify her. Then came the medical exams. Women were tested for tuberculosis, venereal diseases, and other illnesses. They were weighed and measured. Malnutrition was common, but not disqualifying. The exams were invasive and humiliating for many, but they were mandatory. Next, the soldier himself had to receive approval from his commanding officer. The military wanted to ensure that the marriage was legitimate, not a scheme to smuggle someone into the United States. The soldier had to prove he could support a wife financially. He had to demonstrate that the relationship was genuine. Paperwork piled up, forms in triplicate, interviews with officials, waiting periods that stretched for weeks or months. For women living in bombed-out cities, the process felt endless, but it was the only path forward. The stigma began even before the women left Germany. Neighbors whispered. Former friends turned away. "You are abandoning your country. You are sleeping with the enemy. You are a traitor." The accusations stung, but the women pressed forward. Shame was a price they were willing to pay for survival. In America, suspicion awaited them. German war brides were viewed with distrust. The war had ended only months earlier. Memories of Nazi atrocities were fresh. Many Americans could not separate the individual women from the nation they came from. The label stuck: German, enemy, other. Despite the obstacles, the numbers grew. By 1950, approximately 15,000 German women had married American soldiers and emigrated to the United States. Each woman carried her own story, her own reasons, her own fears. For some, the proposal came quickly. A soldier she had known for only a few weeks asked her to marry him. She said yes, not because she loved him, but because she saw no other option. For others, the relationship developed over months. Shared meals, walks through ruined streets, conversations pieced together with broken language. But even in those cases, necessity often outweighed affection. One woman described the moment she accepted a proposal. He asked me in English. I did not understand all the words, but I understood what he was offering, a way out. I said yes. I did not think about love, I thought about living. The decision was made, the paperwork was filed, the approval came through. Now came the hardest part, leaving. The journey began with goodbyes. Women packed what little they owned into small suitcases or cloth bundles. A photograph of family, a piece of jewelry, a worn dress. There was no room for sentimentality, only the essentials. Saying goodbye to family was agony. Mothers held daughters and wept. Fathers stood silent, their faces carved with grief. Siblings clung to each other, knowing they might never meet again. The women promised to write. They promised to send packages, but everyone knew the truth. This was likely the last time they would see each other. The train ride to the port was long and cold. Women traveled in groups, escorted by military personnel. They stared out the windows at the landscape they were leaving behind. Ruined cities, burned forests, fields scarred by war. Germany was broken, and they were abandoning it. At the ports, ships waited. Vessels like the SS Zebulon B. Vance carried hundreds of war brides across the Atlantic. The women boarded with a mix of fear and hope. They had never been on a ship before. Many had never left their hometowns. Now they were crossing an ocean to a country they knew only through propaganda and rumor. The Atlantic crossing was rough. Waves rocked the ship. Women huddled in cramped quarters below deck. Seasickness swept through the passengers. The smell of vomit mixed with the salt air. But the women endured. They had survived worse. During the voyage, bonds formed. Women shared stories in whispered German. They spoke of their families, their fears, their hopes. Some admitted they did not love their husbands. Others insisted they did, as if saying it aloud would make it true. They were strangers bound by a common fate. Language lessons began on the ship. A few women tried to teach each other basic English phrases. Hello, thank you, I am hungry. The words felt strange on their tongues, but they practiced anyway, knowing they would need them. When the ship finally reached the American coast, the women crowded onto the deck. They stared at the skyline, New York, or another East Coast city. Tall buildings, lights, movement. It was overwhelming, nothing like the rubble they had left behind. The arrival process was chaotic. Immigration officials checked documents. Names were called. Women were separated from the group and sent to meet their husbands or travel onward. Some soldiers were waiting at the dock. Others had already returned to their hometowns, and the women would travel alone to meet them. The train journeys inland revealed the scale of American abundance. Women pressed their faces to the windows, staring at farmland that stretched to the horizon, barns full of livestock, fields of corn and wheat, towns with intact buildings, no rubble, no craters, no signs of war. It was disorienting. For years, they had lived in scarcity. Now they were surrounded by plenty, but they had no access to it. They were passengers, dependent entirely on the men who had brought them here. Meeting American families was often the first real shock. Some families welcomed the German brides with warmth, others greeted them with cold silence. The women could feel the judgment in every glance. She is German. She is the enemy. Why did he bring her here? In small towns across America, the arrival of a German war bride was an event. Neighbors whispered, shopkeepers stared, children pointed. The women felt the weight of being other. They did not speak the language, they did not understand the customs. They were strangers in a land that was supposed to be home. The first meals in America were another jolt. Abundance on the table. Meat, bread, butter, vegetables. More food than they had seen in years. Some women ate slowly, savoring every bite. Others felt guilt twist in their stomachs. My family is starving and I am eating like this. The reality of marriage set in quickly. The soldier who had seemed kind and generous in occupied Germany was different here. He was tired, traumatized by combat, struggling to readjust to civilian life. Some men drank, others grew distant. A few became violent. The women had no recourse. They did not speak English well enough to ask for help. They had no money of their own, no documents, no support network. They were completely dependent on their husbands. If the marriage was bad, they were trapped. Language isolation was suffocating. Simple tasks became ordeals. Ordering food at a store, asking for directions, understanding a doctor. The women stumbled through broken English, humiliated by their own inability to communicate. Some gave up trying. They stayed home, silent and invisible. Loneliness pressed down like a weight. In Germany, even in the ruins, there had been community. Neighbors, family, shared language. Here, there was nothing. Just the four walls of a house and a husband who often did not understand her. At night, some women lay awake and wondered if they had made the right choice. They had escaped starvation, but they had traded one kind of suffering for another. And this suffering was harder to name. It was not hunger. It was not cold. It was the slow erosion of identity, the loss of self. Daily life in America settled into a rhythm, but it was a rhythm built on silence and adaptation. The German war brides learned quickly that survival here required a different kind of endurance. Not physical, but emotional. Not against bombs, but against isolation. Learning English became an obsession for some. They listened to the radio, repeating words they did not understand. They watched their husbands speak, trying to mimic the sounds. They asked neighbors to teach them, swallowing their pride with every mispronounced syllable. Progress was slow. Frustration was constant. Others gave up. They retreated into German, speaking only to themselves or in letters home. The language became a refuge, a way to hold on to who they had been before. But it also deepened their isolation. If you could not speak English, you could not participate in American life. Hiding the past became a survival strategy. Many women were told by their husbands or in-laws to never mention Germany. Do not speak German in public. Do not talk about the war. Do not remind people where you came from. The pressure to Americanize was relentless. Change your name. Change your accent. Change yourself. Some women obeyed. They buried their identities under layers of forced assimilation. They cooked American food, even though it tasted wrong. They wore American clothes, even though they felt foreign. They smiled and nodded and pretended to belong. But the cost was high. Identity is not something you can shed like a coat. It clings to you. And when you try to erase it, you erase part of yourself. Community hostility was a constant undercurrent. In small towns, everyone knew the German girl. Shopkeepers served her last. Neighbors did not invite her to gatherings. Children were warned to stay away from her house. The label Nazi was thrown around carelessly, even at women who had never supported the regime. One woman recalled going to a church social. She stood alone in the corner, holding a cup of punch, while the other women chatted and laughed. No one spoke to her. When she finally left, she heard someone whisper, "I do not know why he brought her here." She cried the entire walk home. Economic dependence trapped the women in ways they had not anticipated. They had no money of their own, no job, no way to earn. If they wanted to buy something, they had to ask their husbands. If the husband said no, that was the end of it. The women who had survived starvation and war now found themselves powerless in a land of plenty. Domestic violence was not uncommon. Some soldiers, traumatized by combat, took their anger out on their wives. The women had no one to turn to. They did not know how to call the police. They did not know their rights. And even if they did, the shame of admitting failure kept them silent. Divorce was an option, but a terrifying one. If a woman left her husband, she risked deportation. She had no money, no job, no support. Where would she go? Back to Germany, where her family was starving. The trap was complete. Longing for home was a constant ache. Letters from Germany arrived sporadically, carrying news of continued hardship. Families still struggled to find food. Cities were still in ruins. The women sent packages when they could. Canned goods, clothing, soap. But it never felt like enough. Some women dreamed of returning. They imagined walking through the streets of their hometowns, seeing familiar faces, speaking their language without shame. But those dreams faded over time. Germany was no longer the place they had left, and they were no longer the women who had left it. Children complicated everything. When babies were born, the women felt a new kind of pressure. These children were American. They would grow up speaking English, eating hamburgers, pledging allegiance to a flag their mothers barely understood. The women loved their children fiercely. But they also felt the distance growing. Their children would never fully understand where they came from. Rare moments of connection offered brief relief. In some cities, German war brides found each other. They formed small groups, meeting in homes or church basements. They spoke German. They cooked German food. They shared their stories without fear of judgment. For a few hours, they could be themselves again, but those moments were fleeting. Most of the time, the women lived in silence. They adapted. They endured. They survived. But survival came at a cost. The cost of identity. The cost of belonging. The cost of ever feeling truly at home. One woman wrote in a letter to her sister, "I am alive. I am fed. I am warm. But I am not whole. I do not know if I ever will be again." By the summer of 1945, the war in Europe had ended. But the war in the Pacific dragged on. Then, in August, 2 bombs fell. Hiroshima, Nagasaki. The world changed in an instant. Japan surrendered. The war was over. For the German war brides in America, the end of the war brought a strange mix of emotions. Relief that the killing had stopped. Grief for the millions who had died. And a gnawing question. What now? Germany was occupied, divided into zones controlled by the Allies. The country they had left no longer existed in the same form. The future was uncertain. But one thing was clear. They were not going back. Not anytime soon. Maybe not ever. As the years passed, the women aged. Their children grew. Some marriages survived. Others did not. Divorce rates among war brides were significant in the first few years. The strain of cultural differences, language barriers, and unmet expectations broke many unions. But for those who stayed, life settled into a new normal. They learned English. They made friends slowly. They found work sometimes. They built lives piece by piece. But the past never left them. In the 1950s and 1960s, some women began to speak about their experiences. Historians and journalists interviewed them. The stories they told were complicated. Not tales of romance, but of survival. Not stories of love at first sight, but of cold calculation and desperate choices. One woman said in an interview, "I married him because I was starving. I stayed because I had nowhere else to go. But over time, I learned to care for him. Not love, maybe, but something close." Another woman was more blunt. "I do not regret my choice, but I do not celebrate it either. I survived. That is all." Return visits to Germany were rare but emotionally devastating. Women who went back found cities rebuilt but unrecognizable. Families had moved. Friends had died. The Germany they remembered existed only in memory. Family reunions were bittersweet. Mothers and daughters embraced after decades apart. But the distance was palpable. They had lived different lives, spoken different languages, become different people. The bond was still there, but it was frayed. The question persisted. Did they make the right choice? Most women refused to answer. It was not a question with a simple answer. They had survived. Their children had grown up in safety and abundance, but they had paid a price. A price measured in loneliness, shame, and the loss of identity. The legacy of the German war brides is not found in grand narratives or heroic tales. It is found in the small, quiet moments. A woman teaching her daughter a German lullaby. A recipe passed down, even though the ingredients are different. A photograph kept in a drawer, too painful to display but too precious to discard. These women revealed uncomfortable truths about survival. That it is not always noble. That it requires compromise. That it can mean choosing life over honor, safety over belonging, the future over the past. They also revealed truths about war. That its consequences outlast the battles. That the people who survive carry scars that never fully heal. That the line between victim and collaborator, between enemy and ally, is often blurred beyond recognition. Compared to other war brides, British, French, Italian, the German women faced a unique stigma. They had married men from a nation that had fought against their own. They had left a country that had committed atrocities. The judgment was harsher, the suspicion deeper, the path to acceptance longer. But in the end, their stories are human stories. Stories of women who faced impossible choices and made the best decisions they could with the information they had. Stories of women who chose survival, even when survival meant exile. One woman, interviewed in her old age, said, "I thought my enemy would break me with violence. Instead, he broke me with kindness. I cannot forget the taste of that first hamburger, the sweetness of that first Coca-Cola. It follows me still, like a shadow." The final lesson is this: survival is not always a triumph. Sometimes it is simply the act of continuing, of waking up each day and choosing to live, even when living is hard. Even when living means carrying contradictions that can never be resolved. The German war brides chose survival. They paid the price in silence, and their stories buried for decades deserve to be told, not to judge them, but to understand them, to honor the impossible choices they made, and to remember that war does not end when the guns fall silent. It echoes through generations, carried in the hearts of those who lived through it. Wars end, nations rise and fall. But the small acts, a soldier offering food, a woman accepting a proposal, a child born in a new land, those acts leave marks that outlast the noise of cannons. They remind us that even in the darkest hours, humanity persists. Complicated, contradictory, but undeniably human. If you found this story meaningful, make sure to subscribe for more true accounts of World War II history. These stories, though buried in time, still speak to us today. They remind us of the choices humans make when survival is the only law, and they force us to ask ourselves, what would we have done